Hi, my name is Sam. I'm working as a lead architect in our enterprise cloud division at Amanox Solutions. I would like to present to you a PoC implementation we did using Nutanix Calm automation and ServiceNow as an end user portal. ServiceNow, of course, also delivers many more functionalities, but for this demonstration, we will only show the service catalog functionality of ServiceNow, where we can order different kinds of virtual machines. Calm is receiving all information put into ServiceNow and will then execute on-premise automation using Nutanix as a virtualization platform, but also as a software-defined networking solution using microsegmentation. Arista has been used as the networking layer, Palo Alto for everything that is firewalling aside from microsegmentation. Rubrik is our next generation backup, and Infoblox is everything IP address management as well as DNS infrastructure. This as a short overview. We have 2 sites in place, so we can provision on either site. We also use replication for disaster recovery purposes, whether that be on Nutanix storage or Rubrik backup. So everything is basically mirrored at each site. We have different networking zones, and depending on if we remain in the same zone or if we cross, for example, from a secure zone to the DMZ zone, we have Palo Alto firewalls where we have to open up ports or allow connections. Within the same zone, we use microsegmentation, for example, to separate between tenants. So this is a multi-tenancy environment, and that is important for every layer, whether that be the Nutanix layer for virtualization and storage or firewalling layer, and so on. For this automation demonstration, we will only integrate with Nutanix for virtualization, storage replication, and microsegmentation. We integrate with Rubrik for automated backup and Infoblox for IP address management and DNS. The provisioning workflow will first reserve an IP address. So all the information put into ServiceNow will be sent to Calm. Then the Calm blueprint will first reserve an IP address, will assign a DNS entry based on the host name and the domain that the user specified. We will then create microsegmentation policies. That's an optional part. Number 3 is the actual VM provisioning. For this demonstration, we are using Windows 2016, which uses sysprep to configure IP addresses, DNS, to do an Active Directory join, and optionally to install any kind of software that we want to install using sysprep. Then step 4 is application of existing microsegmentation policies. So in this example, we will have a policy separating different tenants, and we will see in the demonstration as well how we can activate and deactivate that policy and what the effect will be on this environment. In step 5, we will apply existing backup policies on Rubrik. Step 6 is configuring the storage replication policy, which is already pre-configured, but we will assign it to the newly created VM. And step 7 is optional installation of VM guests and applications, which we will not show in this demonstration. Compared to sysprep, this is something that would be done using Calm Remote PowerShell, which is an integrated functionality of Calm. But for this workflow, we did not integrate an application. Later on, we will also show the decommissioning workflow, which is part of the same blueprint. This workflow will, of course, delete the virtual machine that we have previously created. In step 2, it will also release the IP address and remove the DNS entry on Infoblox. We will remove the storage replication policy. If we created any microsegmentation policies, we will also remove those. We will now switch to the demo environment. On one hand, we have Prism Central, which is the central management interface for all Nutanix clusters in this environment. So as we can see here, we have CHA, that's Site A, and CHB. Those are two Nutanix clusters. If we explore this environment now, we can see there are already predefined security policies. And the one we are interested in here right now is the tenant isolation policy. This has been pre-created, and as we can see, it separates all VMs categorized as tenant A from all VMs categorized as tenant B. Currently, we are running in monitoring mode, so any connections between those VMs are being monitored, but they are not being blocked at the moment. And as we will see later, as soon as we apply this policy, VMs from tenant A can no longer reach VMs from tenant B and vice versa. Speaking about categories, categories are also something we define in Prism Central. We created a new category called tenant. And within that category, I can assign a value of tenant A, tenant B, or tenant shared. Currently, there is 21 VMs categorized as tenant A and 1 VM categorized as tenant B. So this is concerning microsegmentation. If we think about storage replication, I'm going to switch to cluster A at site A. Here we can see we pre-configured multiple data protection domains. The differences are how often we replicate from one site to the other. As you can see here, that's only once a day. That's bronze. If we look at gold, that's every hour. Both of them are of course asynchronous. And if we look at silver, that's every 12 hours. This is just to give an example how it could be configured. Currently, it's only asynchronous for AHV. So that's what we can see here with these three options. If we look at the backup side, implemented here using Rubrik. And Rubrik has a concept of SLA domains, similarly to the categories that we've seen in Prism Central. As we can see here, we also have a domain bronze, silver, and gold. And as you can see, there are differences in how often we take backups, and potentially also for how long we keep them, if they're replicated to another site, and so on and so forth. So our goal is using automation to also apply these rules to newly created VMs. VMs can of course also be seen inside this interface. So if I select AHV VMs, we already have many VMs discovered. The last piece that I would like to show you is info-blocks. So info-blocks, as mentioned, is used for IP address management as well as DNS. We have different networks defined. I'm going to drill down here. As you can see, we have again internal zone for customer A and internal zones for customer B. I'm going to drill down to the customer A zones, and here again we see there is 3 subnets. I'm going to select the first one here. And as we can see, some are already registered. So all these are reserved IP addresses, and they also have DNS names assigned to them, as we can see here, a record. I will now show you how a blueprint looks like in Prism Central, where we actually see the code that will automate these different pieces. We are now back in Prism Central. where we are opening up the apps view, representing Nutanix Calm. We have different options here. I'm going to select blueprints. And as we can see, we have multiple blueprints which represent the service catalog items on ServiceNow. I'm going to open Windows 2016. What we can see here in this blueprint is the actual virtual machine that we are provisioning as part of this blueprint. But we can also see other components here, which are called existing machines, as we can see here. So everything that Calm is automating, which is not created by Calm, is called an existing machine. So what do we need to provision a Windows VM? We need, of course, a template. This is a Windows 2016 standard template that has been prepared for sysprep, so it has been generalized. And we have our sysprep file. I'm going to make that bigger here. And as we can see, there's multiple variables here which start with @ and these funny looking brackets here. These are called macros in Calm, and we have multiple of these. So everything that we have to dynamically fill at time of execution, we have to do by using those macros. So we see that's, for example, host name, it's things like domain, but also credentials which are used, as well as IP addresses and so on and so forth. So this is just standard sysprep, so you can extend that as much as you like, or you can make it simpler depending on your needs. We also have one NIC attached to this VM, and at time of creation we check remote PowerShell login. We also use credentials, of course, to log into that system. This is a check that we are doing as part of the provisioning workflow to be sure that for later further automation that we actually have a working remote connection. Talking about credentials, what we can see up here is an option to show the credentials. For this blueprint, we have multiple credentials defined. We have the local admin account that we apply to this image. And as you can see here, I cannot look at those credentials once they are entered. Also, if I would export this blueprint and import it to another environment, I would have to reapply the credentials. So this is something that is not actually being exported with a blueprint. We have a domain service account for Active Directory join. We have an Infoblox service account to access the Infoblox system. We also access Prism, for example, to apply the storage replication. A Palo Alto service account, which is not currently being used, and Rubrik service account. So how is this workflow being processed? There is different stages. If we look, for example, at Infoblox, but the same is true also for Rubrik and all the other so-called services here, we have something called a creation stage. For all these different components, we can put tasks, one or multiple tasks, which are executed at time of creation. When this blueprint is first instantiated and the Windows VM is created. So as you can see here for Infoblox, if I click on this task here, I can see there is a script being executed, and that's a Python script. Nutanix has a Python sandbox where you can execute Python scripts. We have again macros being used here, and if I scroll down, we have, for example, certain actions taking place to fetch an IP address, to set a DNS record, a PTR record, and then to fetch additional attributes from this Infoblox network. And as we can see here, we have different expected output variables that we will use again as macros in other scripts. Some of them are actually even used as part of the sysprep file. If we now look at rubric at the create stage, we can again see there is a task here. And similarly to what we've seen for info blocks, we use REST calls again to first refresh all the VMs that rubric can see in its inventory. Normally, a refresh doesn't take place all the time. So this is something that is just being told from time to time by rubric. So what we are doing here is we force a refresh after we provision the VM on Nutanix. We will then wait using the task ID that we received during the first step. We will then query if this task has been completed. So every 5 seconds we will query. Once this completes, we fetch additional necessary information and finally apply the backup SLA that we have already seen on rubric. Lastly, I want to show you what we do with the Nutanix piece. This is essentially connecting to Prism, and as you can see here, we have multiple things happening. So we first have something that is configuring the protection domain for this VM. Again, using REST calls. As you can see here, this is actually pretty straightforward. So we are just setting certain variables in the JSON file, and then we submit this JSON file for this particular VM. And as you can see here, this UUID, this macro is actually being filled at time of creation. So when the VM is created, this ID, this UUID, is generated as part of the VM creation, and it is then used within this Python script to apply the protection domain. Similarly, we are updating the categories. We are creating a security policy, and we are then setting the category for this VM. So these are the most important tasks for the creation stage. If we delete a VM again, or a so-called application in Calm, we will actually go through the deletion stage. So this is what we call decommissioning. For info blocks, when we delete this app, we have a release IP script. This is simpler, and as we can see here, what we do is deleting host records and deleting reservations, so that this IP is actually available again for other VMs to be provisioned. For rubric, for deletion, we don't do anything because we want to keep the backup. So even if we delete the VM, we just want the backup to remain on rubric. On Nutanix, we again have 3 tasks. We have delete protection domain, which essentially removes that VM from the protection domain. We delete any security policies we've created. And we also remove any categories that have been created as part of this workflow. What I didn't mention before, and I'm gonna go back to the creation stage here. If we look at add security policy, I just quickly want to show you how easy it is to create microsegmentation policies. That's what we can see here as part of a REST call. We will now provision 2 VMs, one as tenant A and one as tenant B, using the ServiceNow interface. For this use case, for this particular POC, the goal was to have everything triggered out of ServiceNow, which also gives us additional flexibility in terms of how we customize the wizards to provision the VMs. So we can see here the ServiceNow interface. I'm now logging in as tenant A. First thing we will see is the service catalog, where we have essentially the blueprints that we've briefly seen before in Calm available here as options to provision. So I'm gonna select the Windows 2016 blueprint. I'll choose a name now. I'm defining the domain name and also the Active Directory domain. I'm going to remain this configured for site A. I'm also going to remain with the size small for this VM. I'm going to select internal customer A network. As you can see, there's other options, for example, DMZ as well. I'm going to configure bronze for backup and gold for replication at the Nutanix layer. Once I click Order Now, all this information can then be sent to Nutanix Calm on premises. So this has been sent now. I'm going to repeat that step now for tenant B. So tenant B. I'm going to do the same thing, Windows 2016. I'm going to call this 02. For this environment, we have a single Active Directory, and so I'm using the same domain name. For different tenants, normally you would have multiple Active Directories. In this case, I can also select another network. Let's say I'm using internal network 2. I'm going to say gold for backup, and I'm not going to configure any replication. It's going to be a local VM only. And again, I'm clicking on Order Now. We will now switch back to Prism Central. The provisioning we can again see using the Apps tab. But instead of selecting blueprints, we will now select applications. And we can already see those two applications, Calm Demo 02 and 01, are currently being provisioned. I'm going to open 01 now. And we will see all attributes or variables that have been transferred from ServiceNow to Calm. The tenant we could not select. This has been automatically transferred based on the tenant that we used when we were logged in. So if I would show you application Calm Demo 02, you would see that it says tenant B here. What I can see here is an audit, which is a great feature of Calm. So I can see in real time all the different stages. I can do a drill down and I can see everything that's happening here. So for example, as you can see here, a task has been executed called reserve IP. As you can remember, this was our script that we use to access info blocks and to reserve an IP address. So I'm going to change the script view here. And as you can see, all the macros have been replaced now by actual input. So here the user, for example, that's a credential that Calm filled in during execution time. So the username automation is part of the credential and the password is not shown here. Then the host name, that including the domain, so the FQDN has been filled here. And if we now look at the output that the script generated, we can see the output, the response from the REST call. And we can also see all these variables that have been extracted from using that script. We can see that the VM has been provisioned. If I open this task here, we can see a lot of REST calls happening. That's not something we programmed, that's something that Calm is doing. And we can see that this IP has been detected, so this has been correctly set for this VM. So the check login was also successful. We can now see that there's something being executed called protect VM. So that's the script. If I view the script here, that's the script that is used to configure Rubrik. If I go back, we can see 3 times this output, waiting 5 seconds for 3 times, so 15 seconds. That's when we refreshed the Rubrik cluster to see the Nutanix VM. And then the additional calls here are to configure the SLA. And we can do that with everything here. If there would have been an error in any of those scripts, this would turn red. The execution of the workflow would stop here, and we could then go in here and actually get the output and use that for debugging purposes. We will now quickly verify if the other VM has also been provisioned. So I'm going to go back to Applications. I can now see for Calm Demo 01 as well as 02 that both are now in the running state. So provisioning for both of them was successful. I'm now going to switch to the Explore view again. Select VMs. I'm going to filter for Calm Demo. And we can see now there's 2 VMs with those IP addresses set. If we look at the Nutanix cluster, as you can remember, for tenant A, for VM1, we defined a gold replication. So as you can see here, for this protection domain, we have this VM that has been automatically added with the workflow. So this VM is now being replicated every hour to the other side. If we look at Rubrik, I'm again going to filter. I'm going to say Calm Demo. So we can see here we have one VM called Calm Demo 01, which has bronze applied, and Calm Demo 02, which has gold applied. So these are the 2 VMs that we provisioned, and they have the backup policy applied as we configured it. So if I go to one of those VMs, we can see completed backup. So this already happened. I can open that and I can go through all the different steps that Rubrik went through to back up this VM. So this is pretty fast using the native AHV API that Rubrik integrated. Lastly, looking at info blocks. I'm going to show this for tenant A now. So we are tenant A, internal zone 1. So I'm going to use this network. So if we go just quickly back here, we see Calm Demo 01 has an IP address of 16.38. I can see that's our VM, Calm Demo 01.cloud.local. And if I click here, I can see using audit history, a record has been defined and IP reservation has been created. We are now going to open the console for VM1. We're already logged in using sysprep. I'm going to open a command prompt. And what I will do now is showing 2 things. I'm going to ping the tenant B VM, which is called Calm Demo 02. So we will see 2 things. One thing is that this DNS record has been created, so it can be resolved, 32.10. This corresponds to this IP address here. And what we can also see is that currently tenant A can ping a VM from tenant B, which is something that we don't want. So how do we prevent that? I'm going to go back to Prism Central here. I'm going to go to Security Policies. As we've seen before, we have a pre-created tenant isolation policy. which is using category. So if I go to categories now, tenant, I can see tenant A is used by 22 VMs and tenant B by 2 VMs. So I want to see those 22 VMs which have been categorized for tenant A. And as we can see here, our VM, Calm Demo 01, is one of them. So I can also verify that by clicking on the VM here, More, Manage Categories, and I can see that tenant A has been applied to this VM, which means that this tenant isolation security policy is active for this VM. So I'm going to close that again. I'm going to go back to security policies, and I will now apply this security policy, switching from the current monitoring status to apply status. And what we will see now, switching back to this command line interface within the tenant A VM, what we can see now is that this request is now timing out. So microsegmentation is instantly applied. The last point I'll show you today is how we will now decommission the VM again. I'll switch back to the applications view. We did not implement that inside ServiceNow, but of course everything that we are doing within this interface can also be done through the Nutanix REST API. We are now going to decommission Calm Demo 01. As we can see here, currently we only have the create phase in the audit view, what we have looked at before. If we are now going to execute delete on this blueprint, and the deletion process is now starting in the background, we can see it here. I'm switching to the audit view again. And what will happen here is now everything that we've defined in the delete stage will now run, and it will, for example, delete the VM, but also release the reservation of the IP address, remove the DNS entries, and remove any configured microsegmentation policies. Fast forward, we can see now that the deletion process finished running, and we can also see that there has been a few warnings, not errors, but warnings during the deletion process. And I'll show you one example here. One task that we programmed is called delete category value, and here the REST call returned code 500 with the following error message. So that's coming from the Prism Central API. The Calm Demo 01 is still associated with one entity and policies. This is due to a coding mistake that we've done in this script, and I left it here. So just to give you an example how this how we can use Calm and the audit view to debug and to see what's actually going wrong. I'm now going to switch to info blocks. I'm going to again look for IP address .38. As we can see, it's not currently being used. It's unused right now. So I'm going to go and look at the audit view. And as we can see here, user automation, which is the service account that we are using to access info blocks, deleted this IP address So it basically released it again so that it can be used by another virtual machine. This concludes this demo. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got a better insight of how easy it is to use Calm using standard programming languages like Python, and I hope this was helpful to you.